Welcome to another episode. I'm glad you're here. As you settle in, I'd love for you to share something simple. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? There's something calming about knowing we're scattered across different places and hours, yet gathered together in this same moment. And if you'd like to join me again for more of these gentle journeys, I invite you to subscribe, so you'll always have a quiet space to return to. Now, picture a stone monastery deep in medieval Europe. The only light comes from flickering candles, their glow trembling across worn wooden tables. Monks lean over parchment pages, copying words by hand, each letter forming slowly under the tip of a quill. The silence is broken only by scratching ink and the soft rustle of vellum turning. For these men, the written word was sacred. Preserving texts meant preserving knowledge itself. But as the years passed, many of them faced the same quiet struggle, the slow blurring of vision. Letters that once seemed sharp began to soften. Margins faded into shadows, eyes strained, and work that once flowed easily became painful. Human beings had always lived with this problem. Sight dims with age, and for centuries nothing could be done about it. Yet, in these dim halls, something remarkable began to appear. Polished stones of quartz and glass, laid directly on top of the words. With them, the letters grew larger, clearer, a small circle of magnified clarity in a world of blur. It was the beginning of a quiet revolution, one that would change how we read, how we learn, and how we age. The story of eyeglasses does not begin with frames balanced on the nose, but with simple stones, carefully polished until they became clear enough to bend light. Long before the invention of spectacles, people sought ways to bring the world back into focus. In the monasteries of Europe, between the 10th and 12th centuries, monks discovered that certain crystals, quartz, beryl, or glass, shaped into a smooth dome, could serve as a kind of primitive magnifier. These were called reading stones. Imagine one. A rounded, polished hemisphere, no larger than the palm of your hand. When placed directly on the surface of a manuscript, the letters beneath swelled in size, dark ink growing thicker and more legible against pale parchment. The principle was simple, though few at the time understood why it worked. Light entering the curved stone bent inward, concentrating and enlarging the shapes beneath. For the monks who copied sacred texts line by line, this small trick of nature offered relief from the strain of fading sight. It is easy to forget just how fragile vision is. By the time most people reach middle age, the eye begins to lose its flexibility. The lens within stiffens, unable to adjust as easily to different distances. This condition, presbyopia, was no less common in the medieval world than it is today. A monk of 50 might find that the words of scripture blurred before him. The fine strokes of an M-dash might collapse into a dark smear. Hours of effort could end in headache, eyes burning from the attempt to force clarity where there was none. In a time when the copying of texts was central to preserving knowledge, this was more than a personal frustration. It was a cultural threat. Manuscripts were painstakingly written on vellum, the treated skins of calves or sheep. Preparing a single book could require months of labor. Every mistake meant scraping the page with a knife, smoothing it again, and writing anew. A monk whose vision faltered might lose his ability to contribute to this sacred task. So when a polished stone made the letters larger, it must have felt like grace. The reading stone became a bridge, not a cure for failing eyes, but a way to keep working, to keep seeing, to continue the labor of preservation. We can imagine the relief, the dim glow of a candle, the narrow margin of a page, and suddenly a circle of clarity. These stones were not limited to monasteries. Wealthy scholars and officials sometimes possessed them as well. But it was in the monastic world, with its strict routines of study and transcription, that their impact was most deeply felt. Knowledge in this period was concentrated in the hands of the church, and the ability to read was both a duty and a privilege. If vision faltered, wisdom risked being lost to silence. Interestingly, the idea of using lenses to manipulate light had already been explored far from Europe. In the Islamic Golden Age, scientists made careful studies of vision, optics, and refraction. The most famous of these was Abu Ali al-Hasan ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as al-Hazen. Born in Basra in 965, al-Hazen wrote the Kitab al-Manazir, or Book of Optics, a work that revolutionized the understanding of sight. He argued against the old belief that rays issued from the eyes to touch objects. Instead, he proposed, correctly, that vision occurred when light entered the eye, refracted through its structures. Al-Hazen described experiments with lenses, mirrors, and apertures, noting how curved glass could bend and concentrate rays of light. His writings spread slowly into Europe through Latin translations in the 12th and 13th centuries. By then, scholars were beginning to piece together the principles that underlay the reading stone's usefulness. But long before theory caught up, practice had already taken hold. Stones polished to smooth curves, resting on parchment, granting sight where nature had withdrawn it. The monks who used them would not have thought of themselves as participants in a scientific revolution. Their world was not one of theories and proofs, but of daily survival and devotion. Imagine the life of such a monk. The day began in darkness with the toll of bells calling the community to prayer. Hours of chanting in the cold stone chapel followed. Then, in the scriptorium, seated at wooden desks, the work of copying began. The air smelled of ink, iron gall made from oak galls and vitriol. Candles smoked, leaving soot on stone walls. The silence was broken only by quills scratching across vellum. For younger men with sharp eyes and steady hands, the letters flowed without strain. But for the older brothers, vision blurred. Squinting, they leaned closer, seeking the shape of a letter, the curve of a word. Errors crept in, shoulders stiffened, brows furrowed. And then, a stone, set gently upon the page. The ink swelled, the words stood out. Work that had been slipping from their grasp became possible again. In this way, reading stones extended not only sight, but life's usefulness. In a society where age could mean decline and withdrawal, here was a tool that gave back purpose. A monk who might otherwise retire from the scriptorium could continue contributing, his experience still valuable, his hand still at work. The stones themselves were humble objects. Some were made from naturally clear crystals like quartz or beryl, shaped into hemispheres or plano-convex lenses. Others were fashioned from glass, though medieval glass was often filled with bubbles and imperfections. The best stones came from skilled polishers who could grind and smooth the surfaces until they gleamed. A small pouch might carry one, to be set on a page as needed. Unlike spectacles, they could not be held up to the eyes or used while looking around a room. They were tied to the act of reading, enlarging only what lay beneath them. And yet, this limitation did not diminish their importance. They were, in many ways, the seed of what would come later. By learning to shape transparent materials into useful tools, craftsmen laid the groundwork for the invention of spectacles in the 13th century. The reading stone represents one of those quiet, transitional steps in human history, easy to overlook, but profound in effect. Without it, countless texts might have been lost, their words miscopied or abandoned by weary scribes. With it, the continuity of learning flowed on, carrying fragments of ancient wisdom through the dim centuries of the Middle Ages. It is worth pausing here to reflect on how small innovations often carry immense consequences. A polished stone, no more than a few centimeters across, altered the trajectory of knowledge. In it, one can see the convergence of practical need and deeper inquiry, the daily struggles of aging monks, and the theoretical explorations of thinkers like Alhazen. One brought the problem, the other pointed toward the solution. Together, they prepared the way for a device that would extend human vision for centuries to come. And in the candlelit stillness of the scriptorium, the stone glowed faintly under its flame, a circle of clarity in a world that so often blurred with time. The reading stone was only the beginning. It offered clarity, but only when pressed against a page. To truly change daily life, magnification needed to become portable, something that could move with the eye instead of anchoring the reader to a desk. That transformation unfolded in northern Italy in the late 13th century, where the art of glassmaking reached new heights. Venice was the beating heart of this craft. On the island of Murano, artisans guarded the secrets of their furnaces as closely as kings guarded their crowns. By the 1200s, they had mastered techniques for producing clearer, thinner glass than most of Europe had ever seen. The skill of Venetian glassblowers in shaping molten material into delicate forms gave rise to all manner of luxuries: goblets that glittered in candlelight, windows that shone more brightly than oiled parchment, beads strung across trade routes stretching from the Mediterranean to Asia. It was here, amid the flicker of furnaces, that the lens took a leap forward. Craftsmen began to grind small, curved pieces of glass, not into hemispheres to rest on a page, but into thin discs that could be held up to the eyes. These discs bent light in a way more subtle and versatile than a reading stone. Instead of enlarging text beneath them, they magnified the entire field of vision. For the first time, a person could carry clarity wherever they looked. The earliest forms of these devices were simple: two circular lenses joined together by a rivet or a strip of metal. They had no arms to hook over the ears. Those would come centuries later. Instead, the spectacles had to be balanced on the nose, pinched between the brow and cheek, or even held in place by hand. They were sometimes called rivet spectacles, or pince-nez, meaning pinch nose. To our eyes they may seem awkward, but compared to the immobility of a reading stone, they represented a revolution. The first known mention of spectacles appears in 1306. A Dominican friar named Giordano da Pisa delivered a sermon in Florence in which he remarked, "It is not yet 20 years since there was found the art of making eyeglasses which make for good vision. And it is so short a time that this new art, never before extant, was discovered." His words suggest that spectacles had only recently entered common knowledge, perhaps invented in the 1280s. The anonymity of their inventor has long been a subject of debate. Some later claimed the credit belonged to Salvino da Marte of Florence, though the evidence for this rests on shaky ground. What is certain is that the idea emerged in Italy, where skilled glassmakers and scholarly demand converged. The universities of Bologna and Padua, not far from the Venetian workshops, created a market of aging scholars desperate to keep reading Aristotle and Galen. The monasteries still required endless copying of texts. Merchants who pored over contracts and account books also found spectacles invaluable. Demand grew swiftly. The craft of spectacle making soon developed into a specialized trade. In Venice, guilds were formed to regulate the production of lenses. These guilds kept their techniques secret, forbidding artisans from leaving Murano, lest they share their knowledge elsewhere. Punishments for betrayal could be severe, even deadly. This secrecy ensured Venice retained a near monopoly on high-quality glass, though other Italian cities, particularly Florence, became centers of spectacle assembly. The lenses themselves were still rudimentary. Convex lenses were the first to be made, designed to help with farsightedness and presbyopia, the common affliction of aging eyes. Concave lenses for nearsightedness came later, not until the 15th century. Grinding was done by hand, using abrasives like emery or fine sand. The curvature was measured not with instruments, but with experience and practice. The results were inconsistent. Some pairs provided relief, others distorted or blurred. Yet even a crude improvement could mean the difference between labor continuing or halting. Imagine a scholar of 60, his eyes dim from years of reading by poor light. Without spectacles, his work dwindles. He can no longer lecture, copy texts, or read letters without constant frustration. Then he acquires a pair of rivet spectacles. The letters swell into focus again. Suddenly, he regains not only his ability to work, but his identity as a scholar. For him, these awkward little lenses would feel like nothing less than salvation. The spread of spectacles transformed European intellectual life. They extended the productive years of scholars, theologians, and lawyers. Universities, which flourished in the 13th and 14th centuries, now had professors who could continue teaching and writing into old age. Monks could copy manuscripts longer. Merchants, the lifeblood of Italian city-states, could check accounts and contracts with renewed clarity. The glasses themselves became symbols of learning. Paintings from the late Middle Ages sometimes depict saints or scholars with spectacles perched on their noses, a subtle sign of wisdom and authority. But access was not universal. In the early years, spectacles were costly, made by hand with precious glass. They circulated first among the wealthy and the clergy, those whose lives depended most heavily on the written word. Over time, as techniques improved and demand grew, they became more common. By the 15th century, traveling peddlers sold spectacles along trade routes, carrying boxes filled with different pairs to suit different customers. Buyers would try on several until they found the pair that gave them the clearest view. The Venetian guilds worked tirelessly to maintain quality and protect their secrets. In 1300, regulations were issued for the Arte dei Cristallieri, the glassmakers' guild, including rules for the making of lenses. By the mid-14th century, eyeglasses had become enough of a staple that municipal records mention them in inventories of goods. Their presence in wills and dowries shows they were valued possessions, passed down as carefully as jewelry or tools. It is striking to consider how quickly spectacles became embedded in culture. Within a few decades of their invention, they were not rare curiosities, but practical necessities. In a sense, they democratized aging. Where once middle age marked a slow decline into visual obscurity, now it was possible to remain fully engaged in study, trade, or devotion well into one's 60s or 70s. The intellectual world of Europe, already enriched by translations of Arabic and Greek texts, now had more time to absorb and expand upon them. The leap from reading stones to spectacles might seem small. One magnified text directly, the other magnified through the air. Yet the impact was immense. The reading stone kept a man bound to his desk. Spectacles freed him to carry clarity wherever he looked. The reading stone was a tool of necessity. Spectacles became companions of daily life. And yet, for all their promise, spectacles were still imperfect. They slipped from noses, pinched the face, and often needed to be held in place. The technology of temples, arms that extended over the ears to secure the frames, would not arrive until the 18th century. But even in their earliest, most awkward form, spectacles were revolutionary. Venice's secrecy around glassmaking ensured that Italy remained at the center of the spectacle trade for centuries. Murano's furnaces glowed night and day, artisans shaping molten glass into globes and discs, polishing them into clarity. To the outside world, these workshops seemed almost alchemical, transforming sand and fire into windows for the failing eye. And perhaps they were, for in those lenses lay the possibility of extending human capacity, of giving back years that failing sight would otherwise steal. When Friar Giordano da Pisa told his congregation in 1306 that the invention of eyeglasses was new, he could not have known just how lasting their influence would be. In his words, we catch a glimpse of the excitement, the wonder of those first years when spectacles were no longer rumor but reality. People marveled at them, spoke of them in sermons, recorded them in inventories. Within a generation, they had shifted from novelty to necessity. And as they spread outward from Italy, carried by merchants and scholars, spectacles reshaped the possibilities of age and learning across Europe. A simple pair of riveted lenses, fragile, awkward, often crude, ensured that the written word would remain visible to those who needed it most. They were the beginning of a new clarity, both literal and intellectual, a transformation born of glass, fire, and human ingenuity. The invention of spectacles may seem, at first glance, a minor thing. A pair of curved lenses, awkwardly riveted together, balancing on the nose. And yet, their impact reached far beyond the individual eye. They altered the rhythm of human life, stretching the span of intellectual productivity and reshaping the course of scholarship, law, medicine, and theology. Before spectacles, the arc of a scholar's life was constrained by biology. The youthful years, when sight was sharp, were spent in apprenticeship, copying, reading, learning. By middle age, when experience and wisdom ripened, the eyes often betrayed their owner. A man in his 50s might still hold vast knowledge, but the pages before him blurred, making it harder to read or write. The sharp edge of his mind remained, but the tools to exercise it slipped from his grasp. Spectacles changed that. Suddenly, scholars in their 50s and 60s could continue working as though time had been slowed. Professors lectured longer, scribes copied more manuscripts, judges read more cases, physicians examined more texts of Galen and Hippocrates. In monasteries, older monks no longer had to retreat from the scriptorium, their experience wasted. Instead, they could continue guiding younger brothers, ensuring continuity and accuracy in the transmission of texts. This extension of intellectual life may seem subtle, but multiplied across thousands of scholars and officials, its effect was profound. Universities, a relatively new invention in Europe during the 13th and 14th centuries, relied heavily on professors with decades of study behind them. The University of Bologna, with its focus on law, and the University of Paris, famous for theology, both flourished in this era. Spectacles allowed professors to keep reading the canon texts, to write commentaries, to debate with clarity well into their later years. Without them, much of this accumulated wisdom might have faded earlier. The same was true in medicine. Physicians needed access to ancient treatises, often written in fine script on vellum. With glasses, these texts remained legible, allowing medical traditions to be studied, preserved, and expanded. In law, aging judges could continue consulting vast tomes of precedent, their decisions carrying the weight of a longer career. In theology, spectacles extended the reach of church fathers and scholars whose voices might otherwise have dimmed with their sight. The effect was not limited to intellectual elites. Merchants, too, benefited. Contracts, inventories, shipping records all demanded sharp vision. An aging merchant in Venice or Florence who could not read his accounts might have been forced to rely on younger assistants, leaving himself vulnerable to mistakes or dishonesty. With spectacles, he retained autonomy, able to check the numbers himself, to calculate risk and profit with clear eyes. In the world of trade, this was not just convenience, it was power. Over time, the accessibility of spectacles expanded. Initially confined to the wealthy, by the 15th century they began to spread more widely. Peddlers carried boxes filled with lenses, offering pairs for sale in town squares. Customers would test them by holding books or letters at arm's length, searching for the pair that brought words into focus. This practice was crude, but it democratized clarity, making glasses available beyond the cloisters and universities. And then came a second revolution, the printing press. In the mid-15th century, Johannes Gutenberg of Mainz, perfected the art of movable type. For the first time, books could be produced not by months of hand copying, but by pressing inked letters onto paper in rapid succession. What had once been rare, a book, a collection of knowledge, became increasingly common. Prices fell, literacy spread, the Renaissance blossomed. But here is the important link. The rise of printed books coincided with the availability of spectacles. One without the other might have faltered. What use is a cheap book if the reader cannot see its words clearly past the age of 40? What use are spectacles if books remain scarce and prohibitively expensive? Together, the two innovations formed a kind of partnership. Glasses gave aging eyes clarity, and printing gave those eyes more words than ever before. Knowledge no longer slipped away with age, but accumulated across decades, carried forward by minds that could now see well enough to continue absorbing it. We can think of it as a quiet multiplier effect. The press expanded the reach of ideas horizontally, spreading them across the population. Spectacles expanded them vertically, stretching them across the span of a human life. Ideas traveled farther and lasted longer. The combined result was an explosion of scholarship and creativity. Renaissance thinkers, from Erasmus in theology to Copernicus in astronomy, drew upon this extended well of knowledge. The clarity of vision, literal and metaphorical, underpinned the clarity of thought that defined the era. It is tempting to view spectacles only in terms of practicality, but they also carried symbolic weight. To wear them was to be associated with study, with seriousness, with age tempered by wisdom. Paintings of the 15th and 16th centuries often depict learned men with spectacles, perched precariously on their noses or dangling from cords. In some cases, the glasses were more emblem than tool, a visual shorthand for intelligence. They conveyed not just the ability to read, but the identity of the reader as someone worth listening to. Spectacles also reshaped the experience of aging. Before their invention, the dimming of sight was a reminder of mortality, a narrowing of the world. A once independent man might become dependent on others for reading, for writing, for understanding. Glasses delayed that loss, preserving a sense of dignity. They allowed individuals to carry on with familiar tasks, to remain engaged in community life, to keep their sense of self intact. The simple act of reading a letter from a friend, or studying scripture at dusk, could now continue into later years. In this way, spectacles softened the harsh edge of time. There is a quiet metaphor in all of this, that clearer vision leads to clearer thought. Of course, the relationship is not literal. Glasses do not sharpen the mind, but they preserve access to the tools of thought, the written word, the page, the diagram, the account. In doing so, they protect the continuity of intellectual life. A blurred page interrupts the stream of learning. A clear page allows it to flow. Clarity of sight becomes clarity of possibility. Consider how small the objects themselves were. A pair of riveted lenses, fragile and often flawed, carried in a pouch or balanced on a nose. And yet, from these fragile discs of glass emerged a shift in how human beings experienced age and time. Life was no longer divided so sharply between youth, when one could learn, and age, when one could no longer read. The boundary softened, time stretched, minds remained active longer, societies drew more deeply upon the wisdom of elders, and knowledge accumulated across generations with greater fidelity. When we look back, it is easy to see spectacles as inevitable, just another step in the long march of progress. But in their moment, they were astonishing. They gave back what time had taken. They allowed a scholar to continue lecturing, a monk to continue copying, a merchant to continue trading. They kept doors open that biology had begun to close. And so, in this modest invention, we glimpse something profound about human ingenuity. It is not always the grand, dramatic breakthroughs that reshape our lives. Sometimes it is the small, almost invisible tools that alter the texture of daily existence. A circle of glass, no larger than a coin, changed the balance of time and age for millions. As you think of this, imagine again that candlelit desk. An older man sits there, the text before him blurring at the edges. He sighs, rubs his eyes, and lifts a pair of spectacles. Perched on his nose, they bring the page into focus. Letters sharpen, words emerge, meaning flows again. He leans forward, quill in hand, and continues his work. Outside, the world is changing. Books multiplying, ideas spreading. And inside, so too is time itself. What was once lost has been returned. Something so small, so fragile, gave humanity not just clearer sight, but longer years of thought. In those lenses, we see a reminder: clarity, once found, reshapes the way we live with time. As our time together draws to a close, think of the simplicity of it all. A small curve of glass, nothing more than melted sand and fire, reshaping how human beings lived with age. For centuries, blurred vision was simply fate. Words faded, tasks slipped away, and the world grew dim. But then came the reading stone, and later the spectacle, fragile companions that returned clarity to countless eyes. They allowed scholars to keep writing, merchants to keep trading, monks to keep copying. They extended the rhythm of thought, carried knowledge across generations, and softened the edge of time itself. It is easy to overlook inventions so small, so ordinary, that we forget their wonder. And yet sometimes it is these quiet things that change us most. As you drift now, perhaps with eyes closed and mind resting, carry with you the thought of that circle of clarity on a candlelit page, a reminder that human beings have always searched for ways to hold on to vision, to preserve meaning, to see more clearly the world around them. Thank you for listening and for sharing this moment. If you haven't already, I invite you to subscribe, so you'll always have a calm space to return to. And tell me, if you'd like, where you are in the world and what time it is there as you listen. Until next time, may your sight, inner and outer, remain clear.